Okay, thank you very much, Joshua. Marhaba, ahlan wa sahlan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for coming. Uh, so many of you will know who this is. This is, of course, the famous Andalusian sage and mystic and Sufi, amongst many other things, Ibn al-Arabi al-Hatimi al-Ta'i. Maybe for some of you, this is the first time that you might come across him. Either way, this presentation is for each and every one of you. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. Okay. So maybe some of you don't need convincing as to why we need to learn maybe about his life or to uh, maybe learn something new about his life. Why do we need to listen to a presentation or read about it? But for other people, I would say that the reason we are doing this, and by the way, before I begin, this is the book I've written on Ibn Arabi's religious pluralism. It came out last month, and you can get your copy if you like from Routledge website, if you so wish. And we can talk more about that some other time. But the reason I think it's so important to learn about Ibn Arabi, and I've dedicated a lot of my time to this very important person, is because he is a significant cornerstone in the entire Islamic tradition. I think if you were to not have Ibn Arabi in the Islamic tradition, you would be frankly missing something from the entire tradition without exaggeration. There's a saying about the Greek philosopher Plato, um, when someone said that his importance is such that everything that came after him was a footnote in history to his teachings, and was a footnote to his teachings, right? Uh, Now, the professor James Moore said the same thing about Ibn Arabi, and that is no exaggeration. Everyone who came after Ibn Arabi in this tradition is a footnote to him. It is very hard to surpass Ibn Arabi in the profundity of his thought and the uniqueness of his insights and the depth and the breadth of his entire contribution to the Islamic tradition. And when we say his contribution, it is to something called metaphysics, which is a bulky word, but metaphysics is the science of studying being, what is being and what is the nature of being, and the root of all of our beings. So that's called al-ilahiyat to them. And the tradition of wisdom, seeking wisdom, the sapiential tradition, which is called hikmat al-khalidiyya. So he has um, shaped the course of everyone who's come after him and the whole Islamic world for the past 850 years after he came onto the scene. So his presence is, without exaggeration, one of the most important people to have come across and to have come up in history. And he's also a beloved saint in his own right. He's beloved in Damascus, he's beloved throughout the entire world. But not many people know who he is. And his life is worth learning about for so many reasons because it is an enjoyable story in and of itself. For people who specialize in the arts here, there is something massive for you in the story of Ibn al-Arabi. And I think there is no other person I know of in the entire Islamic intellectual tradition and history, maybe apart from the prophetic seerah, with regard to how much information we have on Ibn Arabi and his life. It's no exaggeration. You could probably produce a Netflix series on his life alone. That's how much detail we have, which is what makes it all the more enjoyable. But it also allows us to go into so much depth into his own life and learn the lessons from his own life, and just to see what struggles he faced, the drama he encountered, and all the obstacles he had to overcome to become who he was. Um, and that is something worth watching as well. So I know that you're presented with a reading list to go over before this presentation and session began. But over the course of the next 8 weeks, I would like you to treat this as a movie you're watching. If you manage to read the suggested reading material, that's fine, no problem. But if you're unable to, then just treat what you're about to see like a movie, get some popcorn out, and enjoy it. In fact, I think like if you were to come into class even without having done the presentation, you'll still get something amazing out of the presentation. Like I have since I've been studying Ibn Arabi for the past maybe 2 decades, for the better part of 2 decades. And so this is a story of sainthood, how Ibn Arabi becomes a saint, the importance of sainthood in the Islamic tradition. Really, it's so in Arabic it's called walaya, and walaya is I think without exaggeration the lifeblood of this religion. If it's quite extraordinary that we could have grown up. Many people could have grown up without having even heard of Ibn Arabi's name, despite his massive influence over the entire Islamic world, and kind of and maybe we have grown up without knowing what a wali is or what walaya is, even though it's so central to our tradition. So thank you for coming, and without further ado, we can begin the story. There has been a significant upshot in studies in Ibn Arabi, what's called Akbarian studies in the past 2 centuries, maybe 150 years. And academics will generally find him confusing. He has been accused of having a disorderly fantasy, maybe the fantasies of a psychopath. And as for he has produced adversaries over the years as well, who regard him as an unbeliever. But I think Imam Dhahabi, who is the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, he's a bit more well-rounded than Ibn Taymiyyah. But Imam Dhahabi, who's a major Hanbali scholar and a major scholar in his own right, he's a bit more nuanced about Ibn al-Arabi, and he says, look, the knowledge that he produces and that one reads about in his writings, I'm convinced that he's a saint. So personally speaking, I'm convinced that he's a saint, but it's so dangerous, it would be better to hide behind one's cows than to actually read this sort of knowledge, hence the picture of the cow. But the majority of the Islamic world, since his influence is so wide, he is known as the Sheikh al-Akbar, who is the greatest master of all time. And so this is his quest towards the peak of sainthood, and so the story begins in Andalusia, in a relatively quiet year in the suburbs of Murcia. And this is where Ibn Arabi is born in 1165. In the Hijri calendar, it is 560. And he is the only son to his parents. And he has 2 sisters. I don't think he's had any other siblings. And he was most likely born to what we might consider what we might call the aristocracy. He was born in a very affluent family, and this is because he comes from his origins come from Yemen, so he's actually Yemeni by origin. And so when the major families of Yemen migrated to Andalusia, they held important positions in the Andalusian government. Now, Ibn Arabi was born in a very politically tumultuous time period when the different political parties of the era were fighting one another. So this is called the Ta'ifa period, when Andalusia was not really united, but was divided into various municipalities, and they're ruled by particular sultans. And so Ibn Arabi was born in Murcia at the time when it was being ruled by a group called the Al-Muwahidun or the Almohads. Now, his father worked in the military. And so Ibn Arabi was effectively born into a military family. So he tells us, since I was old enough to wear a sword belt, I did not cease riding horses or mounting steeds, examining saber blades, or parading in military camps instead of poring over the pages of books. And so he was fascinated by the military in his young age. And so everything points to Ibn Arabi having a military career, or he could have become what's called a katib. he could have become a secretary to one of the people in higher offices. But no one who knew him well enough would have guessed that he was going to become something else much later on in life. And so in his early years, he used to love hunting, and he had a relatively carefree existence. So his father was a high-ranking dignitary in the service of the Al-Mahad Sultan, and so his father had to provide for the family. Um, and in this period, when you have competing dynasties who are trying to struggle for power, there is often a change in power, one after the other, one dynasty after the other. And so that's a very hard position to maneuver. And so that was the position Ibn Arabi's father was in. And so he was criticized for participation in power. Because for some people, participation in power unavoidably meant participation in corruption. And so Ibn Arabi tells us that one night he invited one of the sheikhs, one of the saints, to stay over in his house. And then he tells us this: my father was one of the Sultan's men, but when he entered, the sheikh greeted him, since he was an old man. When we had performed the prayer, I brought food for the sheikh and sat down to eat. My father joined us in order to benefit from the sheikh's spiritual grace. After a while, the sheikh looked at him and said, "Oh, unhappy old man, is it not time you felt some shame before God? How long are you going to associate with these oppressors? How shameless you are! How can you be sure that death will not come upon you in your evil state?" And my father broke down into tears at his words and plainly realized his plight. And as for myself, I was completely taken aback by all this, because the particular individual ruling the government at the time was someone called Ibn Mardanish, who was actually fighting the Almohads. And he's an interesting character in himself. So, despite the Sheikh's sharp criticism of Ibn Arabi's father, uh, this does not mean that he was a lukewarm Muslim, devoured by ambition for lust and power. In fact, it turns out that Ibn Arabi's own father himself was one of the saints and was one of the awliya himself. And more specifically, what Ibn Arabi calls one of the men of the breaths, bimanzil al-anfas. Now, if this sounds like a strange term to you, Ibn Arabi has a penchant for categorizing the holy people and the saints. And he categorizes them into multiple categories, like maybe some 100 categories without exaggeration. And he's got a whole chapter dedicated to that, the Futuhat, called chapter 73 of the Futuhat. And there are just a great number and variety of different saints. So you'll always come across him talking about them. And so Ibn Arabi says that his father belongs to the group of awliya called the Rahmaniyun, those who are ruled by the divine name called Ar-Rahman. And so that comes from a well-known hadith in which the Prophet Muhammad says, the breath of the All-Merciful comes to me from Yemen, and that's Nafas al-Rahman. And he can feel it coming to him from Yemen, which was a sign of the sheer piety of the people of Yemen, and their really how it was a sign of how special they are. And so Ibn Arabi says that this category of saints, their particular speciality is that they can perceive spiritual and physical realities through the sense of smell. It's a kind of karama, a kind of miracle, if you will. And so Ibn Arabi says that someone who is in this spiritual station, in this spiritual position, way station called the Manzil al-Anfas, he says that one of his distinguishing features is that at the time of his death, he is declared alive even though he is dead. But if his pulse is taken, then you realize that's when he is really dead, but when you first see him, it doesn't look like he's dead. And this was the case with my father, Allah yarhamu. Uh, so for a while, we hesitated to bury him. So closely did he resemble a living person by the expression on his face, even though his pulse had stopped beating. And his breathing resembled someone who was already dead. But if you did not take his pulse and you looked at him, you would have thought he was alive. Um, so 2 weeks before his death, he had told me, so this is Ibn Arabi speaking, he told me that he was going to die and his death would take place on a Wednesday. So this is one of the other special characteristics of the awliya. They sometimes know when they are going to die. And if maybe to people who are not familiar with the subject, I don't know how familiar all of you are. I know some are familiar, some are not familiar. If this seems strange, uh, welcome to the world of Ibn Arabi, in which these things are everyday norms. You are getting a peek and insight into a very strange and wonderful aspect of society, I guess, into the Islamic culture and tradition, where these things um, happen, people experience them, and they've continued to this day. So then Ibn Arabi said, on the day when he died, he was seriously ill. He sat up without any support and said to me, my child, today is the day of departure and meeting. And so I replied, in this journey, God has written your salvation, and in meeting, he has blessed you. He was delighted by these words, and he said to me, may God reward you. My child, everything that I heard you say, in which I did not know, and at times I reproved you for, which means I sometimes disagreed with you for, that now is my profession of faith. Then a white glow appeared on his forehead, in contrast to the color on the rest of his body. But it caused him no pain. It was a radiant light which my father was able to see. This glow then spread over all his face and finally covered the whole of his body. I embraced him, bade him farewell, and as I was leaving, he said, or I said, I'm going to the great mosque. I will remain there until I am brought news of your death. And then my father replied, go, and do not allow anyone to come and see me. Then he called his wife and daughters to his side, and at midday, I was told that he had died. Now, this happened when Ibn Arabi was 30 years old. But so even if they had disagreements about Ibn Arabi's life and the way he lived his life, a saintly life, it would appear that his father did not really understand Sufism. But nevertheless, all disagreements disappeared when confronted with the danger of death. Then only tenderness remained. And so Ibn Arabi, he probably would have suffered from inwardly from his father's reservations towards him and Sufism. But when the danger of death was presented, then they were united. So he says, one day I became seriously ill and I was plunged into such a deep coma that I was believed to be dead. In that state, I saw horrible looking people who were trying to harm me. Next, I became aware of someone kindly, powerful, and exhaling a delightful fragrance who defended me against them and succeeded in defeating them. Who are you? I asked. The being replied to me, I am the chapter, Surat Yasin, and I am your protector. Then I regained consciousness and found my father, God bless him, standing at my bedside in tears. He had just finished reciting Surat Yasin. And this is when he was very young. So that's his father. So in other words, Ibn Arabi basically comes from a family of awliya, to make it a long story short. And so even his ammo, his uncle on his father's side, was also a saint. There are also two saints on his mother's side, his akhwal. And so we'll get into those as well. This is his ammo, his father's brother, Abu Muhammad Abdullah. And so this is what he tells us about them. Now, Ibn Arabi would have been 12 years old at the time of his coma, right? But even in these stories, he's still a young boy. And so Abu Muhammad Abdullah, he himself would have been in his 80s, a very old man. And so he worked as a pharmacist. There's an older word you could use, which is someone who works in an apothecary, right? But he was basically a pharmacist. And so one day he made a sarcastic remark to a little boy, but scholars think this little boy is Ibn Arabi himself, but he's not really specific about that. So Abu Muhammad Abdullah makes a sarcastic remark to this little boy who knew nothing about medicine. And this is the story. There's a shop near Abu Muhammad Abdullah's house, which belonged to a man who sold fresh herbs and drugs. My uncle often used to go and sit with this man in his shop. One day, a handsome young boy who bore the marks of worship came up to him, thinking him to be the owner of the shop, and asked him for some white najalla. Najalla is just like habat soda. They're black seeds, right? Which is normally black. And it tends to have some medicinal properties that are known. So then my uncle replied jokingly, or in a jocular tone, and what's that supposed to be? So the boy explained that he had been suffering from a certain complaint and that a woman had told him to go get some white najalla or white seeds. So then my uncle said, when I saw how ignorant you are, I laughed at you because najalla isn't white, it's black. Then the boy said, oh, uncle, my ignorance in this matter will do me no harm in the sight of God, whilst your heedlessness of God will do you much harm, seeing that you persist in your opposition to him despite your advanced years, which is a really strong comeback. So my uncle took this warning to heart and served the boy, becoming converted on the way. What's the way? It's called the tariqah. At his hands. He lived 3 years after coming to the way. During this time, he attained to high spiritual degrees and came close to the mercy of God. So basically, Ibn Arabi's Amr became a saint when he was around 8 years old, towards the end of his life. And then he used to, so because of that, Abu Muhammad Abdullah used to dedicate half of his recitation of the Quran to the boy who's responsible for converting Ibn Arabi's uncle to the way, although it's most likely Ibn Arabi himself. And so Ibn al-Arabi's uncle is also probably one of the what you call Rijal al-Anfas, just like Ibn Arabi's father, one of the men of the breaths. And so Ibn Arabi tells us, while I was sitting in his house, he would often say, the dawn has come. Now remember, there were no like electronic watches back then. And most likely his house had no windows. So then I once asked him how he knew this, seeing that he was sitting indoors, to which he replied, my son, God sends forth a wind from beneath the throne, which blows in paradise, and which at dawn blows from paradise, so that every true believer feels it every day. And then this is his uncle on his mother's side, Yahya ibn Yughan. He was the prince and ruler of a small kingdom in Algeria. And he gave up the throne to be an ascetic. So he, again, we're talking about categories, right? So if Ibn Arabi's father is one of the Rijal al-Fas and one of the Rahmaniyun, then Yahya ibn Yughan is one of the Zuhad. He's a Zahid. He's an ascetic. And so an ascetic is someone who has renounced the world and renounced who of their own free will have renounced the goods of this base world and who have preferred God to his creatures. So Ibn Arabi says, one of my maternal uncles was one of these ascetics. He was the ruler of Tlemcen, and his name was Yahya ibn Yughan. During this time, there was a man named Abu Abdullah al-Tunsi. One day, the saintly man who was Abu Abdullah al-Tunsi was walking in Tlemcen between Aqadabir and the town center. And my uncle, Yahya ibn Yughan, the king, so he was a king at the time, surrounded by his retinue and followers, crossed paths with him. He was told, there is Abu Abdullah al-Tunsi, the holy man of our age. The king reined in his horse and stopped. He greeted the old man, who greeted him back. The king, who was magnificently dressed, asked him, Sheikh, since he had like a question of fiqh, Sheikh, is it permitted for me to do my prayers in the clothes I am wearing? So then the old man burst out laughing. And he said, what are you laughing at? The king demanded. And then he replied, at the pettiness of your understanding, at the complete ignorance of your soul, and at your state. Nothing resembles you more closely than a dog, which is covered in blood from a carcass it was devouring, and it was devouring the flesh in all its complete uncleanness. And then it decides, oh, I have to urinate, so it lifts its paw very delicately so as not to soil itself with urine, when in fact you are a bowl filled with dirt. Like, you ask me about your clothes while you are responsible for all of the injustice that your subjects are suffering in your kingdom. And then the king burst into tears, dismounted from his horse, and there and then renounced his kingdom. He placed himself in the service of the sheikh, who put up with him for 3 days, but then came to him carrying a piece of rope and said, King, the 3 days of hospitality which were prescribed have passed. Get up and go and work. Get up and go and collect some wood. Because there's an Arab tradition, which is well known, that a stranger may, you are supposed to host someone for 3 days, and really without asking questions if they are in need of being hosted. But once the 3 day period is up, you can ask them for information or ask them to leave. So it was that he started gathering wood, carrying it on his head, and taking it to the market. There the people wept when they saw him. He would sell the wood, take what he needed to feed himself, and distribute the rest in charity. He stayed in his town doing this until he died. He was buried alongside the Sheikh Abu Abdullah, who was frankly his teacher. The Sheikh had the habit of saying to people who came to him to ask him to intercede with God on their behalf, so to do shafa'ah with God. He said, go and ask Yahya ibn Yuhan. He is a king who renounced his kingdom. If God had subjected me to such a test, maybe I wouldn't have abandoned my kingdom. And then Ibn Arabi tells us that he actually went to meditate at the maqam, at the grave of his own uncle. And so I don't know where Ibn Arabi got the story from, but scholars say we must assume that this is at least a family tradition that was passed down to him, and he heard it from a family tradition. And his last khalo, his last mother's brother, uncle on his mother's side, Abu Muslim al-Khawlani, he says that he was one of the Abad. And the Abad are a category of saints who are not gifted with spiritual insight. They're not gifted with spiritual unveilings. They're not really gifted with a mystical understanding of reality or a deeper understanding of the Quranic verses. They're not gifted with an immediate understanding of the Quranic verses, but they never cease to contemplate. They never cease to think about and contemplate the terrors of the Day of Judgment, the bridge, the Sirat, heaven, hell, Jannah, Jahannam, and this is what they think about. And there's a very wide range of different categories of awliya. So this was his third uncle. And so he says, my maternal uncle, Abu Muslim al-Khawlani, was one of the greatest of their kind, one of the greatest of the Abad. He would stay standing in prayer all night long, and when his strength started to fail him, he would hit his legs with sticks, which he kept specifically for this purpose. And then he would say to his legs, you deserve more blows than my horse does. If the companions of Muhammad believe that they will have the Prophet all to themselves, then, by Allah, we will push them up around him until they realize they have left behind them men who are worthy of the name, which means worthy of the name Sahaba. And we don't know a lot about Ibn Arabi's mother, other than she used to frequent one of Ibn Arabi's teachers who was a female. So he had male teachers and female teachers. And we'll learn more about his teachers in the next lesson, in the next session next week. And so she was called Fatima bint Ibn al-Muthanna or Fatima bint Nuwan. This is Ibn Arabi's teacher. And so she said to Ibn Arabi's mother, who used to visit her quite often, his teacher Fatima bint Ibn al-Muthanna, used to say to me, I am your divine mother and the light of your earthly mother. When my mother came to visit her, Fatima said to her, O light. Now, I think maybe she might be playing on Ibn Arabi's mother's name. I'm not sure what her name is. So her name could be Noor. But anyways, either way. O light, this is my son, and he is your father. So treat him with filial respect and do not disobey him. He is your father, and then she tells Ibn Arabi, I am your divine mother and the light of your earthly mother. And so what she obviously means by that, as Ibn Arabi is the spiritual father of his own mother, given his probably incredibly unique talents and unique abilities, starting even from a very early age. So the first 8 years of Ibn Arabi's life was spent behind the high walls of the small independent kingdom in Murcia. Then his family left Murcia for Sevilla, and Seville. But Seville bore no resemblance to Murcia. Seville was a very large city, overpopulated, and swarming with people. It was noisy and it was gaudy. So Ibn Arabi led a very quiet existence in Murcia, and Seville was a much more populated, urbanized area. Arabs mixed with Berbers and Andalusians as well, and Muslims mixed with Christians and Jews. The most distinguished jurists kept company with poets and philosophers, and the most depraved libertines rubbed shoulders with the greatest saints. So it was this incredible melting pot. It was also a city of almost great and irresistible temptation. This is how Claude Adas, in her biography of Ibn Arabi, described it. So there is a saint, a Christian saint, who is well known. His name is Saint Francis of Assisi. When he described his life before he became a saint, he used to call it, "In the time of my sinful youth." So when Saint Francis of Assisi used this phrase, preceding his dramatic conversion, who died 10 years before Ibn Arabi did, we know what he meant. But what did Ibn Arabi mean when he uses a kind of an analogous phrase, when he says, "In the time of my jahiliyyah"? So Ibn Arabi talks about the time of his jahiliyyah in Seville, which is, and jahiliyyah, of course, in case you don't know, is the time of ignorance and paganism that preceded the coming of Islam. Now, we need to take a closer look at what he was doing in his childhood. As the son of a noble and rich family, Ibn Arabi's years of adolescence were peaceful and carefree. He seems not to have attended Quran school, where one historian called the teachers ignorant and mediocre. He probably had private tutors. At home, but in any case, we know for certain he studied the Quran with a man of the path, a man from a tariqah, in other words, a Sufi, named Abdullah al-Khayyat, to whom he would always remain deeply attached. As he says, "When I was a child, I studied the Quran with him and had a great affection for him. He was our neighbor. Of all the spiritual men I have met since returning to the path, there is not one of them I've wanted to be like, except for him and his brother." And he would meet up with them later on in Egypt, later on in his life. So it was in Sevilla where he also went hunting, which was one of his hobbies. Now, he says that once, so this is where he uses the word jahiliyyah. Once during the period of my jahiliyyah, when I was traveling with my father between Carmona and Palma del Rio. Now, Carmona and Palma del Rio are to the west of Seville. So, and they most likely had to go outside the city in order to hunt. So he says, "I came across a herd of wild asses grazing. I was all set to go off and hunt them, but my servants were quite some way away from me. I thought to myself and resolved in my heart that I should not harm any one of them by hunting." So he decided not to hunt them. "When the stallion I was riding caught sight of them and started off towards them, I pulled the horse back. I reined him in, spear in hand, until I came up to them and moved amongst the wild donkeys. The head of the spear I was holding was so low it could have pierced the back of one of the animals as they grazed, but by God, they didn't even raise their heads. Then my servants caught up with me, and as soon as they arrived, the asses ran off. I had no idea how to account for this until I returned to this path, that is to say, the path of God, of Sufism, and Walaya, of course. It was only then, through observing social interaction, that I realized the cause of it, namely, that the sense of common security that I felt in myself towards them had communicated itself to the donkeys. So, stop ill-treating others and be truly impartial in your judgment. God will help you, and the creation will obey you. Blessings will impart themselves to you, and suspicions will be lifted away from you." That's the lesson he wants us to take away from this example in his youth. And he never describes anything about his own life except he wants to use it as a demonstration for a teaching. That's the whole purpose of why he writes these things and why he used to write so much about himself. So we have to just consider why he used to write so much about himself. Like I said, you could do a Netflix series on his life, maybe a season 1, 10-part episode, 15-part episode, without exaggeration. And probably the reason he used to write so much about himself was to use it as a demonstration to facilitate his teachings. When you are so immersed in the acquisition of an art and the acquisition of a discipline and the practice of a discipline, then you become the transparent means by which you show people what you have acquired, what you have attained. You are your own proof, right? And that's very different to pontificating and just writing tombs of what you think is correct. But then you are not the example of what you tell people to do. That there's a massive difference in that. So whilst Ibn Arabi was enjoying his relatively carefree youth, we need to take a look at the broader geopolitical context of what was happening around him. So, 1179, so when he would have been like maybe about 14, 15 years oldish, was called a Black Year. The Guadalquivir River, which is a major river in Spain, burst its banks and flooded the countryside and devastated the crops. The peace treaties with Leon, Castile, and Portugal expired. As I said, this was a time of political turmoil as the Christians of the era, the Franks and the Castilians, were gradually winning back Spanish land as the years went on, which they called the Reconquista. And the King of Portugal, Alfonso Enriquez, sent his son Sancho to attack Seville. The two armies came face to face at an area called the Al-Kharafe, and the Almohads were defeated. Nevertheless, none of that seemed to disturb the trouble. Sorry, none of that seemed to trouble the easy and comfortable existence of Ibn al-Arabi, judging from his silence on these events. He was presented into the upper class society of Andalusia through his father, but the teenager felt drawn in a different connection. He had a presentiment of certain inner spiritual needs, although he hesitated to take the crucial step, which is towards, I guess, towards sainthood or towards wilaya. So this was basically his period of jahiliyyah, his ignorance. He was torn between his desire to enjoy the world and his desire for God. He had a vague apprehension of what the truth was, but did not know it in its fullness. So it's not correct to say that he disobeyed God or that he sinned, but he only gave him the bare minimum. So he was in a state of what you might call ghafla. So then he tells us a story, an example of that, in his book, The Ruh al-Quds fi Munasahat al-Nafs. He says, as the night drew to an end, so he used to enjoy poetry recitations and dancing as well. So he said, as the night drew to an end, my wicked companions and I went off to get some sleep because we were exhausted after all the dancing. We would go off to our beds just as the hour for the dawn prayer was approaching, which is Salat al-Fajr. We would then perform the smallest possible ablution, which is wudu. Anything less would not have deserved the name wudu at all. So they did the bare minimum. It might perhaps go to the mosque, but most of the time we chose instead to perform the prayer at home by reciting the shortest chapters possible. Occasionally, when I was feeling better, disposed than the others, I would perform my ablutions and go to the mosque. If, when I got there, I was told that the prayer had finished, that gave me no cause for sorrow. Precisely to the contrary. So what that means is that it's called the jama'ah. I mean, if someone like Ibn Arabi would have been horrified at his past that he missed the jama'ah of the Salat al-Fajr. So he said, that gave me no cause for sorrow. On the contrary, if I happened to arrive in time to perform the prayer behind the Imam, one of two things would happen. Either I was completely absorbed in thinking about the marvelous night I had just spent listening to an excellent musician declaiming some fine verses. In this case, I would spend the entire prayer rehearsing the same thoughts over and over again until I no longer knew what the Imam was praying or which prayers he had recited, but simply saw people doing something and imitated their gestures. Alternatively, sleep would start to overcome me, so he would get sleepy. And in that case, I would keep watching the Imam to see if he had finished, the prayer. The lengthy recitations, the long qira'at or qira'ah would become unbearable. And inside myself, I would start insulting him. And I would say, there he goes off on this, on Surah Al-Hashr or Surah Al-Waqi'ah. Why couldn't he have just been satisfied with reciting Surah Al-Infatar or Surah Al-Fajr? Didn't the Prophet ﷺ himself recommend that prayers be kept short? So this was an incredibly interesting confession on his part, and it's too realistic to be simply a case of the kind of, I think, what you call artificial literary devices that sometimes you find in these kinds of books, where it's written just to make someone look good, or to illustrate a certain point, like repentance, or what's called in Latin metanoia, toba. This is very realistic, as it gives you detail by detail, detailed accounts about his life. So we have an interesting portrait of Ibn Arabi here. He admired his old uncle, who one fine morning left the pharmacy to devote himself to God. He revered Abdullah al-Khayyat, with whom he was discovering the mysteries of the Quran, and secretly dreamed of one day being like the saintly man. And yet at the same time, he would not renounce, at least not yet, those long nights of music in the company of his friends. This is Claude Adas saying this, which is a really good summary. He was jahil, he was ignorant. He had not taken the plunge. His return was not a sudden renunciation from sheer debauchery. This period was no more than a phase of heedlessness and distraction. So if he was going towards the path of sainthood and then suddenly he makes tawbah and decides to leave his old life and pursue a new life, saintliness, that raises several questions. When did it happen? How did it happen? And why did it happen? And so at some point during the period of distraction, he obtained in Sufism what is called an opening or fatah. This is a spiritual opening or illumination that marks the acquisition of a higher station in one's spiritual journey. Now, what that means is that Ibn Arabi had a fatah when he was just a boy, when he was very young, maybe before he was even 15 years old, probably when he was about between 13 to 14 years old, which is extraordinarily young. The normal way what you might call a murid, a traveler on the path obtains fatah, is to undergo long and meticulous and methodical, and undertake these methodical steps towards doing tawbah and going through the proper stations of Sufism before he achieves any kind of success. For Ibn Arabi, he got the fatah straight away. And so he says that's not the case often, but it's quite rare, but it could happen, and it happens with some people. So it happened with Ibn al-Arabi. So his particular illumination was a rare one, and it's of a certain kind that it is of a certain kind called al-jadhba. Jadhba, which is an attraction. He was immediately pulled towards the divine. And so Ibn Arabi says, I began my retreat, which is khalwa. I began my retreat at the first light of dawn, and I had reached opening fatah, before sunrise. I stayed in my place, the same place, for 14 months. Though through that I gained all the mysteries which I put down in writing after the opening. My opening was a single attraction in that one moment. And so what happened in that opening? He says that all the divine sciences that he gained was from that one opening. Everything we have mentioned after that in all of our speech is only the differentiation, like the detailed writing of the all-inclusive reality which was contained in that look at the one reality. So when did this happen? He was young, and he clearly obtained it before he met the famous Aristotelian philosopher Averroes or Ibn Rushd. And so Ibn Arabi's father was friends with Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Arabi told his father about his opening, his fatah, his illumination, enlightenment, if you like. And so maybe to verify whether what Ibn Arabi experienced was real or not. He wanted to send Ibn Arabi to the sage of his day that he knew, which was Ibn Rushd, his friend. And so my father was one of his friends, and so sent me to him on the pretext of an errand. But his real purpose was to allow him to speak with me. At that time, I was still just a boy without any hair on my face or even a mustache, which is why we think he was quite young. And Ibn Rushd himself, of course, wasn't just a philosopher of Aristotle who commented on the works of Aristotle. He was the chief judge of Cordoba, and he was the personal confidant and personal physician to the Sultan Abu Yaqub Yusuf, who was the ruler, who was the Almohad ruler over Seville at that time. And so, one of the historians says about Ibn Rushd that he was noble, and there was no one more humble and modest than he was. And from his earliest years, he used to dedicate all his time towards the acquisition of knowledge up to the time of his death. And it was even said that he never in his life stopped his reflections or his reading except on two occasions, the night when his father died and on his wedding night. And so coming back to Ibn Arabi, he tells us, as I entered, the philosopher stood up in his place out of love and respect, and he embraced me and said, yes? So now they're kind of like speaking in code. What does he mean by yes? It's kind of like a yes with expectation. Yes? Like, did it happen? But he's also saying something else. So I said yes. His joy increased because I had understood him. Then I realized what he was getting at. So I said no. So immediately Ibn Rushd became tense and his features changed color and he seemed to doubt his own thoughts. So then he gets to the point. What kind of solution have you found through illumination and divine inspiration? Is it the same thing that we get from rational thought? That's what Ibn Rushd wanted to know. Thought, and you, Ibn Arabi, with spiritual illumination. Do those two things lead to the same thing in the end? Um, and Ibn Arabi replies to him, well, yes and no. Yeah. Sorry, if I freeze, let me know. And if you can hear me now, yeah, tell me. So Ibn Arabi says and replies to him, yes and no. Between the yes and the no, spirits take flight from their matter and next break away from their bodies. So he responds to him with an enigmatic and mysterious statement. But Ibn Rushd understood the ishara, if you like. Ibn Rushd understood the good. Ibn Rushd understood the hint Ibn Arabi was giving him. So his face turned pale, and he began to tremble, and he began to recite the hawqala. It's called the hawqala, la hawla quwwata billah, because he understood my illusion. If we have time, remind me, and I'll explain to you what the illusion is exactly at the end of the presentation. So then he gave thanks to God for having allowed him to live at such a time that he could see someone who had gone into spiritual retreat, ignorant, and emerged in such a way without learning or study or any kind of reading. He declared, I myself had said that such a thing was possible, but never met anyone who had experienced it. In other words, he never met anyone who had a fatah. So praise be to God who has let me live during the time of one of the masters of this, one of those who opened up the locks of its gates. Praise be to God who has especially favored me with seeing one of them with my own eyes. So Ibn Arabi is telling us that Ibn Rushd loved him, according to Ibn Arabi's own account. So then Ibn Arabi said, subsequently, I had the wish to meet him a second time. He was shown to me, God have mercy on him, right? So at the time he's writing that, Ibn Rushd is already dead, but he says, he was shown to me in a vision in a certain form. There was a light hijab, there's a light veil that had been placed between me and him. When he says hijab, he's not talking about like a light curtain that you and I know about. Ibn Arabi's having a vision, he means a different kind of veil, one that he saw in his vision. So there's a light veil that had been placed between me and him so that I could see him, although he could not see me and was unaware of my presence. He was so absorbed in his work, of course, his intellectual work of rational reflection, that he paid no attention to me. And I said to myself, this is not someone who is destined to follow the same path as me. So he left him. Now, there is the how. How did he return to the path of God? So the only problem is, however extraordinary and dazzling the illumination may be, if a sincere spiritual vocation is to avoid ending in failure, it must inevitably pass at some time through the stage of Toba, conversion, where he must get down to work and take his work quite seriously. So to answer the question of how, so who helped him return to God? It was a series of three tripletic, three triple visions. A vision of Jesus and Moses and then Muhammad, all in that order, alayhi salatu wasalam. Now he says that Jesus was his first real teacher. So he says, it was at his hands that I was converted. He prayed for me that I should persist in religion in this low world and in the other. And he called me his beloved. He ordered me to practice renunciation, which is, I think, what's the word here? Probably zuhud, and self-denial, tajreed. So Ibn Arabi is saying he had a vision of Jesus in which Jesus told me these things, but really what he also means is that he could see the spirit of Jesus right in front of him, quite extraordinarily. And then he also says about Jesus, he was my first teacher, the master through whom I returned to God. He is immensely kind towards me and does not neglect me even for a second. So he saw Jesus the same way in Star Wars. Luke might see his old dead masters right in front of him. And so Ibn Arabi parted with his possessions, giving them to his father, the same way a dead man is parted from his family, totally and forever. This was a major turning point. He never looked back and never owned anything, not even the clothes he wore, which were lent to him. This is what pure servitude means. So to be a pure servant, that's the point of the path. Al-abd al-mahad. Al-ubudiyya al-mahad. So this is what Ibn Arabi was aiming at. Because the idea that you can own something creates the false illusion of sovereignty, which has to be removed. It allows that object, whatever it is you own, to exercise some kind of control over you, right? And there's also a particular connection between Jesus and Ibn Arabi, which we'll see later on as well. So he always had like a special connection to Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. Now, this particular form of master discipleship, right, is called an Owaisi form of spirituality. And it is when someone who's traveling on the path can meet with a master who has died a long time ago. And that dead master guides him on the way. Just as Uwais al-Qarni never met the Prophet ﷺ, but he was still guided by him, spiritually speaking. And then he had a vision of Moses. And Moses gave to Ibn Arabi the disk of the sun in that vision and told him that from the science of unity, the science of Tawheed, he would obtain direct knowledge from God, which is called ilm laduni. So he would obtain ilm laduni, which is when he would obtain knowledge from God without any intermediaries between him and God, which is compared often to fresh water. The knowledge that is compared to fresh water. Whereas if I take my knowledge from someone else, took it from someone else, that's compared to brackish water, like muddy water, right? And so the difference between fresh water and muddy water is extraordinary. This is why the insights of Ibn Arabi and these kinds of individuals who are given ilm laduni are often filled with creative and spontaneous responses to our problems in our contemporary day and age. They're filled with fresh insights and creative and sheer creativity, That's the result of ilm al-duni. It's a precious knowledge. And finally, he has a vision of Muhammad. And so he says, in my sleep, I saw myself in a huge space surrounded by armed people who intended to kill me. There was nowhere at all I could find refuge. Then I saw in front of me a hill on which the Messenger of God ﷺ was standing. Immediately, I took refuge beside him. He opened his arms. He opened his, sorry, he opened his arms wide and pressed me very forcefully against himself, saying, "My beloved." So he called him Habib, because one of the names of Muhammad is also Habibullah. So he called Ibn Arabi, "Ya Habib, hold fast to me and you will be safe." I then looked around me to see my attackers, my assailants, but there was no longer a single one of them to be seen. From that time onwards, I gave myself to the study of prophetic narrations, which is the hadith. And then Ibn Arabi also tells us that when he woke up from that vision, he spent the rest of the night in tears reciting the Quran. And then we come to the final question. So we know how and when he left his old life, but why did he actually leave it? What was the final nail in the coffin of dunya, if you like, that caused him to pursue the active path of spirituality? So this is what it is. He said, what led me to leave the army on the one hand and to take up the path on the other hand was this. I had gone out one day with the Prince Abu Bakr Yusuf of Cordoba, um, who was the son of the Almohad Sultan. We went to the great mosque, and I watched him while he bowed and prostrated himself in humble and contrite prayer. I then remarked to myself, if someone like this, who is no less than the sovereign of this country, is submissive and humble and behaves in such a way towards God, it is because this lower world is nothing. So I left him that same day, never to see him again, and undertook the path. So every saint who returns to God is faced with a test, the test of abandonment, what's called the fatra. It is a period where God suddenly stops speaking to that particular saint, the saint in making. So it is a period of inescapable slackening, when the spiritual man somehow feels abandoned by his Lord. So this model is taken even from the prophetic seerah, when the Prophet himself experienced the period when Gabriel stopped visiting him. So based on that model, the saint in the making is tested with the same trial. When you know this suddenly stops, spiritual inspiration suddenly stops. So it is a painful and dangerous test. So he says, know that I received this verse from God as an invocation, dhikr, when he called me to him, and that I responded to his call. I practiced it for a time, and then came a period of abandonment, the fatra. This is the abandonment which is well known in the way of the men of God. It inescapably befalls anyone who travels the path. When it strikes, one of two things happens. Either it is followed by a return to the initial state of adoration and spiritual effort, which is the case of those men of divine providence whom God protects, or for others, the fatra persists and never leaves them. They will never succeed. So when the state of abandonment took possession of me and dominated me, I saw God in a vision. So he calls it a waqia, which is just a vision. He recites these verses to me. It is he who sends the winds as a bushra of his mercy, announcing his rahmah. I understood that these verses were a reference to me. And I said to myself, by means of them, he is indicating my initial success through which God guided me under the protection of Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad, peace be upon them all. And so this is the last slide. In a sense, Ibn Arabi arrived at the goal of spiritual realization straight away, following the example of the majlub, the ecstatic. He burned all the stages of spiritual wayfaring in one single leap and completed the journey of the quest. But how can someone who has not confronted the dangers or faced his adversaries and traversed each of the stages one by one claim to be a guide to others? So accordingly, Ibn Arabi was obliged to make the journey again, step by step, to perform the wayfaring, patiently, and truly enter the way. So he retraces his steps backwards so that he can become a guide to other people. This is why he sought out the companionship of his teachers. So next, and by the way, also the Emir Abdul Jazairi, he's also a majdub, just like Ibn al-Arabi. He feels this, he experiences this forceful attraction towards the divine, such that he skips all the stations of tasawwuf and arrives at the goal immediately. But then he also has to retrace his steps backwards and go through each stage again in order to be a guide for other people. So the Emir Abdul Jazairi also had the same thing. He was also a majdub. So next time, since Ibn Arabi needs to retrace his steps, he seeks out the company of teachers. So we will look at uh, we will learn about his teachers next time and what is sainthood, what is wilaya, what are the categories of sainthood, which is all part and parcel of his journey that continues as he progresses towards the peak summit of sainthood. And so we'll also learn about the drama, the experiences in his life, and the challenges he has to overcome, the obstacles he faces in order to become what he became. And so yeah, that's it. See, Joshua, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. So shall we move on to questions?
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Sidi. MashaAllah, that was so beautiful and a great introduction to the life of our Sheikh and a really great, yeah, some good cliffhangers there for the next session. And I think that well, I'll start off because there are a couple of things you mentioned, which I think are important to explain a little bit more. One is the interaction that Ibn Arabi had with Ibn Rushd.
Yes.
And you asked for us to ask you about that. So,
Sure thing. Yes.
um, if you'd like to explain that a little bit more, that might be helpful for everybody too, because it's a very key moment in his life.
Yes, absolutely. So when he meets Ibn Rushd is basically asking him if rational knowledge can achieve what a spiritual illumination can achieve. And so Ibn Arabi is basically saying, well, yes and no. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. Then he makes an enigmatic statement, a very mysterious statement, and he says, between the yes and the no, heads part from their bodies and spirits soar. So this one scholar believes that this is an allusion to a line of poetry from Empedocles, which is written in one of the works of Aristotle. It's an allusion to one of the lines of Empedocles who talks about headless bodies. So Ibn Arabi was only a boy. So one of the theories is that Ibn Arabi couldn't have really known Aristotle when he was that young. So it had to be a form of spiritual inspiration. And so Ibn Rushd was caught off guard when Ibn Arabi mentioned this piece of information that he couldn't have possibly have known. And so the subject that he was talking about, of course, is of course the resurrection. What happens when heads part from their bodies? Because the philosophers used to argue that bodies aren't resurrected, only spirits are. But whereas in traditional Islamic teaching, it's the body and the spirit that's both resurrected together. So he was talking about that.
So we have some questions in the chat. I guess we'll just start with, let's see, I think the first one is from Yumna, who is asking, can you explain what al-Laduni is?
Okay, so ilm laduni, which is mystical knowledge, it's the knowledge that Khidr was granted. And Khidr is, of course, the green man who is mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf in the Quran, who meets Moses. And Moses is unable to understand the actions that Khidr performs because his actions lie outside the scope of Moses' law, because it's not a form of revelation, it's a form of spiritual illumination if you like. And so it is a form of knowledge that's taken directly from God, even though it's not called revelation. So it tends to be mystical knowledge, and it's comparable to what Khidr received. And it is a form of knowledge that people may not necessarily understand because it is beyond the scope and level of one's reasoning. But it is an amazing knowledge.
And Sidi, could you please remind us at what age, this is from Sana, can you remind us what age Ibn Arabi experienced his fath?
He was probably about 13, 14. So before 15 years old.
Mhm.
And
Before
then he,
he, maybe before he hit puberty almost.
yeah, exactly. He was a boy without facial hair. So before he
Mhm.
hit puberty, exactly. Exactly.
And then from Shani, question about the saints who have gift of knowing with smells. Are they also defined by being from El Yemen or not always connected?
It's not always connected. But obviously that's what the hadith says, right? But it's not always connected, no.
Okay. And what are each one of the steps he had to go backwards through? Well, that's a big question.
I mean, I use the word backwards, which is a bit confusing, but it's the same series that any aspirant goes through. First is Toba, then Mujahada, and then so on and so forth. It's the same.
Mhm. And
But
then from
he has to master that maqam.
so from Zanita, let's see. Yes, she says some Muslim philosophers argue that bodies aren't resurrected, right? That's probably a topic that maybe we'll get into at a later point in the course. Will he talk about this at greater length?
Not so much, but like Zanir said, some argue that aren't some bodies aren't. Some philosophers argue that the body isn't resurrected, and some argue that it's just the spirit. Yeah, unless I'm
Mhm.
mistaken, Ibn Sina would have been one of the ones who argued that the spirit was resurrected. So that could have been Ibn Arabi's comments could have been a jab at Ibn Sina, actually.
Mhm. Um, Muhammad, he's asking why is a majdub unable to guide someone if they have already reached sainthood?
Because he didn't go through the steps. He didn't go through the maqamat that leads towards that position and station. So it's like someone who receives, I don't know, top marks for an exam, but without having done any studying. How would you help someone else study in that case? You can't be a guide. You could be someone who's spiritually talented, but you can't be a guide.
It's in the Islamic tradition also there's some thinkers and scholars would say that the Buddha also is included under the umbrella of the prophets. And what's interesting about the story of the Buddha is that he actually did not attain the title of the Buddha until after he accepted the request to teach what he had learned because he had had his own fat, but then only when there was a figure appeared to him and implored him, please, you have to teach
Yes,
what you learned.
yes,
Only then did he attain that. And so and that's, there are some major thinkers in that world who say that's what made him so special is that he held on to his question and he was able to articulate it to people. And so we see that similarly with the Sheikh here.
absolutely, absolutely. That's a good parallel. Thank you. Yes. And then,
Let's
sorry,
see.
someone had their hand up. That's Shani. Yeah.
Danny.
Go ahead, Shani.
Thank you. So I just wanted to clarify a couple of the things that you mentioned. I wasn't sure if they were connected or not. So
Sure.
his fat happened around 14, 15. And the incident you mentioned where he was unconscious and then, Surah Yasin was
Mhm.
basically in his dream. And then did he wake up and see his father reciting Surah Yasin? Is that
Yes.
what happened?
Yes. Yeah,
And
exactly.
were those
Exactly.
two incidents connected? Was that the time he had his fat when he was?
Uh, he doesn't say exactly. All we know is that he had those events when he was young.
So they could potentially have been connected or happened at the same time.
Potentially, but we don't know. It's hard to speculate. But all we know is that he was young when he had these experienced these things.
So the fat was not one time, it was multiple times.
No, it was just one fatah we're talking about. One fatah.
Okay, okay. And then you said something about him saying that after the Fath, he spent 19 months there?
Like 13-ish, yeah. 14, 13, yeah. Yes.
I mean, what does that mean exactly? Like, I mean, because you also
I
mentioned
think
his
I
father died. So
yeah.
he
So
must,
I think he got his fatah in a cemetery, and he just stayed in that cemetery for more than a year.
oh, subhanAllah. So he was talking to his father in the cemetery. I mean, like, his
No,
father.
no. He was he was with his father at the time. He could have had that dream you're talking about, Surya Yasin, before his fatah. It could be before, it could be after, but I would suspect it was before he had his fatah.
So his Fath was in the cemetery, but was it
Yes.
related to someone's grave or just
He
his father sitting in
he
the grave with him?
no, he doesn't tell us. Like his father's not involved. His father's not
Oh,
involved.
so his father's alive at the time.
His father's exactly. And he dies when Ibn Arabi is 30 years old, 30 years old.
Okay. And so we don't know why he was in the cemetery when he experienced this Fath.
You don't know exactly, but Sufis are attracted to like derelict sites, you know,
Okay. Okay.
from far away civilization. They're very attracted to them, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So next question is from Ervina. She asks, is intuition connected to ilm laduni somehow too?
I don't know, but it probably is. But they're not the same thing. They're not identical. They're not equivalents, but there probably is some connection. Sure. Yeah.
Um, Dina is asking about the PDFs. There's a folder that was sent out to everybody with all of the PDFs for each session. There are excerpts from each book for each section. Um, let's see. Senna, can Senna is asking, can you ex also explain the second meeting with Ibn Rushd and why he said this is not someone who is destined to follow the same path as me?
Yes, because Ibn Rushd was too busy with his books. But more important than his books, he was too busy with his own rational thought. Because what the Sufi path requires is for one to empty the heart of love for things in this world, or to empty the heart of anything that's in the world. Ibn Rushd was just smack in the middle of the world, even if it was engaged for, even if it's for the purpose of some higher good. He was still involved with his own self and his own rational reflection. So he was too absorbed in himself to notice what Ibn Arabi was doing. So Ibn Arabi kind of like got the hint. And this is, of course, the way things turned out necessarily, because Ibn Rushd was dedicated to the way of Aristotle. That's very different to Ibn Arabi's own path, for sure.
Mm. If I may comment on that too,
Yes.
this moment of meeting with between Ibn Arabi and Ibn Rushd is it is so powerful actually because this is at a time in the like Sidi Faris had mentioned, you know, the Reconquista is happening in Spain. So the indigenous Europeans are starting to take over the land again. And with that also the work of Ibn Rushd is starting to spread, right? And his emphasis upon Aristotelian thought is being adopted by other thinkers, you know, such as Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic tradition, you know? And so there's this bifurcation that happens at this time in history where Ibn Arabi, and he speaks often about this path of the heart, the people of the heart, Ahl al-Qulub. And it's this, you know, Ibn Arabi leaves Al-Andalus and he goes to North Africa and he goes into the Near East and into Anatolia and he is bearing the torch of he's Ibn Aflatun, right? He is the son of
Yes.
Plato. Whereas this Aristotelian thought, which is much more it's focused on the aql rather than the heart. It's a completely different understanding of life. And so we see how that influenced the development of Western philosophy,
Yes.
theology, ultimately technology and culture. And so this meeting between the two of them is actually it's so powerful. And people, you know, some modern Islamic thinkers like Sheikh Hassan Spiker, you know, he says that Ibn Arabi has the capacity to really open the doors to Islam for to the Western world because of the position that he held at this time. You know, when things really started to shift in the West, that it was that moment. And so Ibn Arabi was kind of like that last waypoint in the Western part of Dar al-Islam, you know, who kind of held that light still in a way. So um, it's very
No,
important.
that's an excellent point. Thank you for raising that. Exactly. It's the divergence of two completely different paths for not just two people, but two civilizations. I know that when we talk about the life of Ibn Arabi, we're getting lost in the details. Sometimes it might even seem overwhelming, especially if you think these things that are happening are quite unlikely, right? But the fact of the matter is that he is giving birth to entire aspects of a whole civilization, and he is birthing a civilization, if you will. The things that will now happen in the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire were already, in a way, happening in someone's house in Andalusia as they were talking about these things. It's really incredibly fascinating. Thank you for raising that. Jazakallah khairan. Yes, Shani again. Or sorry, go ahead, see.
I think Shani, her hand. Did you raise your
Yes,
hand again?
just another
Sure,
quick question. So the
sure.
whole incident with Ibn Rushd, I was really confused by that. So later on, when he wanted to see him a second time, he sees him in his dream. Is that right?
It's not a dream. It's not a
No,
dream.
like a
It's not.
vision,
It's like a
because it's
vision.
after, but
It's
it's
a vision,
after
yeah.
Ibn Rushd is dead, right?
Yes.
Ibn Rushd.
No. He's alive, but it's just like at the time he's writing about the experience. At the time he's
Okay.
writing about the experience, and Rushd is dead.
Okay, but he has the vision of him while Ibn Rushd is alive.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and then after that vision, when he says that he doesn't think he's the right person for him, right? Did I understand that correctly?
He said
That
that we're
that
not. He said that we're not destined for the same paths. Like, so what's the
oh,
point of me wasting my time with him?
talking to him. Okay.
Like, he'll go on his path, which is the path of rationality. I'll go on
Okay.
my path, which is the path of emptying one's heart in order to receive divine inspiration, in order to understand realities that are beyond the ken of one's intellectual perception.
Mhm.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Got it. Got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a few more questions. There's one more thing I wanted to add actually on this point, you know, because
Sure.
I mentioned, you know, the West, right? But then also
Yes.
we have to just mention the East. And if you read the work of William Chittick, and he's given some great lectures on this point, and a lot of his work recently, and also Peter Sanders has really recently released a book on a photography compilation of the Muslims in China, and that Ibn Arabi was the favored philosopher for the Chinese Muslim thinkers, who basically they they found a syncretism, a fusion of their indigenous Chinese Taoist Confucian thinking with Islam. And it was the work of Ibn Arabi which was influential in making that bridge happen.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, you know, some of his works were, you know, soon after his life, you know, they were brought into, you know, through Farsi, through Persian, and then into Chinese. And so this is really an important thing to have in mind that is not widely known, but he bridged almost the entire world except for the Americas, maybe. You know, now he's reaching the Americas, but you know, from Portugal, the westernmost point of the European subcontinent, to China, you know, and the tens of millions of Chinese Muslims, you know. This is a massive span of the planet. So we just to put into perspective the influence of this sheikh.
I
Um,
mean, since you touched on this topic, if I may add to it, this is partly what my work is about, because in the Mughal Empire in India, this is how they get Hinduism to be in dialogue with Islam. And so they bring these two religions into dialogue, which are otherwise seemingly completely incompatible ways of thinking and beliefs. But it is through Akbarian metaphysics that there is flourishing and flowering of this interreligious dialogue that happens in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and produces amazing, amazing works. So I do think that, without exaggeration, it is through Ibn Arabi's teachings one can dialogue with the entire world and all belief systems without exaggeration.
Yeah. There, Sidi, there, let's see, there's a couple more. I think Lazaward's question, we sort of spoke to that already with the encounter of Ibn Rushd. Imran is asking if you can define fath.
Fatah is when something called the veils are lifted from one's sight and insight, and one perceives the realities. Because a fatah basically presupposes that there are layers of reality. So if what you do now is you take a look around the room, what you're witnessing is the physical reality. There's at least 4 other realities beyond the physical reality. Like there's a spiritual world, there's an imaginal world, and there's other things too. So when an opening happens, you are perceiving a reality that is behind the physical reality. You are perceiving things as they really are. What's called in Arabic, al-amr fi nafsihi. You're seeing al-amr fi nafsihi. You're seeing things as they actually are, which is called reality. It's what the philosophers call reality. So that's effectively what the fatah is. Now, there's different grades of openings, different gradations of fatah. But the simplest definition is when the veil is lifted from your sight and you begin to see other things, which Ibn Arabi would then call the realities.
Let's see. Raghda, in response to Raghda's question, how did Plato comment about Ibn Arabi? Although Plato did not make any comments about Ibn Arabi. It was said that Ibn Arabi was the Ibn Aflatun. So he was sort of the inheritor, the what would say the warith, right, of Platonic knowledge. And as far as we know, Ibn Arabi never had no access to the physical works of Plato, but rather it was a spiritual connection that he had with him, or the same kind of knowledge that Plato transmitted in some ways. Ibn Arabi also was a vehicle for. Maham, do openings sometimes come? This will probably be our last question. Do openings sometimes come without the language to be able to express them right away?
Totally. Yes, there's different kinds of saints. But before I mention that, Ibn Arabi mentions Plato. He never read his works, as Joshua said, but Ibn Arabi mentions Plato, and he sees Plato as a spiritual seeker. But that's a topic for another time. So yes, you can have an opening and not have the words to express it. So Ibn Arabi talks about this, and he says that there are people who are gifted with mastery of language, and they can actually talk about what they experience. And there are those who don't have the gift of language, and they can experience the openings and not know how to describe them, or they can describe them with difficulty and not very accurately.
I think we should probably end there because that's our time. So thank you so much, Sidi. It's been a real treat. Oh, yeah.
If people want to stay with me for another 5-10 minutes, I'll stay on, but then everyone else can just go, of course.
And also, just so everybody knows, we will be sharing a link to a WhatsApp chat. So if there are questions in between sessions during the week when you're doing the readings, or if you're recapping the recording from this session, we will be sharing the recording, and we will send out a link to the WhatsApp group for those who would like to join.
Thank you so much all for coming. It's my pleasure to be with you, and I hope to see you next week, inshallah. Thank you so much, and bye-bye. Just to answer Sarah's question, yes, it's connected to that hadith. It's not about the hadith specifically, but it's the same idea behind the hadith. It's to see things as they really are. Yeah, very, very much.
Thank you, Faris. يعطيك العافية.
Allah yafik. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faris. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Sahar. Thank you. Good to have you.
right. Well, if there are no more questions,
then we can just end it. Then till next week, inshallah. Bye bye.